Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a series review of An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. Now I was originally planning to do a review of the first book and then a review of the whole series, but I just thought, you know what, there's no point just doing a review of the first book. I'm just going to review the entire series. I read this series in December. I read the first two books in a day because they are literally like popcorn. And then I read the second two books in a day a few weeks later. And it was just a fun ride. You know, I think I've mentioned before, I don't typically read YA. It's not something that I look to read anymore. This and maybe like one other series were the only two that I wanted to read. And, you know, at the time that I started reading this series, I was reading another very heavy, dense fantasy series. And I wanted something to kind of counteract that so that I wouldn't get burnt out. And that worked really well. And An Ember in the Ashes is just a fun time. You know, it's 4 books. It's a lot of here, there and everywhere, and let's jump into my review and I'll tell you what I enjoyed about it. So the good. The writing is really good. Like, I think Sabaa Tahir is actually one of the few YA fantasy series that I actually rate like on a technical writing level. I think there's quite a lot of like YA fantasy authors and NA, like new adult fantasy authors that just are not particularly good writers, and that really impacts the story. But I think Sabaa Tahir is actually good at writing, and I'm very excited to whatever she works on next because she does get better in each book. The books are action-packed, they're paced generally very well. I did have one issue, but I'll come onto that later. But there's always something happening. There's always something to keep you on the tip of your toes. But at the same time, she's able to balance the quiet moments with the busy moments. I've said this before, I love the quiet moments, the quiet character interactions, when, you know, people are just sat around talking about things. Like, those are my favorite parts, but I do like action as well, and I think she balanced those two things really well. The world building was pretty okay. I don't think it was amazing, but I also don't think it was bad. I think it's very much like a North African, Middle Eastern inspired world, and I think we had a good sense of the scale of the world. I wish we had had more. I think we could have had a bit more demonstration of what the world is like through like the food and the clothes and the music and things like that. We did get some of it, but just not as much as I would have wanted. I love how I just went into a negative straight up, even though I was planning to talk about that later, but there we go. I do think the world building doesn't necessarily impact the overall story. I just would have liked more. But then when I think about the fact that it's a YA story and YA doesn't typically have tons of world building, I can understand it. The magic system is quite interesting. It's an elemental magic system, and I do quite enjoy elemental magic. Like, I quite like people having an affinity to a very specific element, and then they learn and grow that affinity using different tactics and whatnot, tools and all of those things. The thing about this though is the elemental magic can be awakened by efforts, and they are spirits that are commanded by the elements. And so there is a bit of like lore here as well that Sabaa Tahir has created. Again, I just wanted more. Like, I'll come onto this more later, but I think we got enough that made it interesting. I just would have liked more. And again, I'm reading as an adult fantasy reader, not necessarily a young adult fantasy reader. So there is that to keep in mind. Let's talk about characters, which is my favorite category to talk about. And I really did like a lot of the characters. I think they were generally very well fleshed out. I think we generally got a really good sense of who these people are, where they're from, why they're doing what they're doing. And I really like that. I appreciate it. Let's start with Elias. I really like Elias because I think his character has to grow possibly the most. Like, I think he has the most change character-wise. And I think I heard a lot of people say that they didn't like what happened to Elias's character in like the second book. I didn't hate it. I didn't mind it. Like, I think she executed it well. And I think it's very different to what we get in a lot of fantasy, young adult fantasy, fantasy romance, you know, that kind of realm of things. But I like where he ends up, and I think it's very in fitting with his character. Next up, we have Leia. To me, she was the most underwhelming. Like, I found her POVs to be the most boring, to be honest. I don't think there's anything that really sets her out to be a really compelling character. That's not to say that she is a bad character or poorly written. She just didn't stand out for me. Next up, we have my favourite character, and that is without a doubt Helene. There's going to be spoilers for about 30 seconds, so skip ahead if you don't want to hear anything. But I really, really liked her relationship with Aratus. I really like the fact that she becomes this very powerful woman, and yet in many ways she's not powerful at all. She's under somebody else's control. She doesn't have a lot of freedom. Spoilers are ended now. but I just love where she starts being this person who, you know, does everything by the book. And by the time that we get to the end of the series, she's doing things that are right, even though they're not necessarily by the book. And I love that for her character. So well executed, without a doubt, the standout. Next up, we have some of the villains. We have the Nightbringer, Karis Veturia, and Marcus Farrar. I think all of these villains were quite well done. I think Marcus was probably the best well done villain in this series, just because I think his motivations were very obvious why he was doing what he was doing. I wasn't always sure why she was the way she was. We get more colour on that as the series goes. But I don't know if I entirely bought into why she is the way she is in this series. Like, I don't know if I fully buy it. That's not to say, again, that she's a bad character. Because I think she's a good character. It's just I don't know if I bought into her overall hypothesis about the world, you know? The Nightbringer as well, like, I thought quite a compelling character. I liked his connection to Leia, and I quite liked their interactions as well, especially once we get some reveals about him in the kind of first book as well. Like, there are some really great twists as it relates to the Nightbringer, and I quite enjoyed that. Next up, let's talk about themes. So lots of interesting themes around like revolution, about the oppressed rising up, about discovery and identity, finding one's people, duty versus doing what's right. You know, a lot of what you typically see in YA fantasy, but I think it's done pretty well here. I do think there are some pretty adult themes as well, but they're handled in a way that would resonate with a young adult audience and isn't too graphic. So I do really appreciate Sabaa Tahir for being able to do that. Now let's move on to things that I had issues with. So one thing I talked about earlier was the world building, so we'll scratch that off. I do think, as it relates to pacing, I don't think it needs to be a 4-book series. I think it could have been a 3-book series. I actually think this would have made a really good duology. I get wanting to do a trilogy though, and I do think book 3, I think it was book 2 or book 3 where I felt a little bit like, okay, this needs to be a bit sharper. And I would have just liked both of those books to have been halved and mashed together, or like even 1 or 2 storylines being taken out and we just had 1 book. Not to say that I hated it, but I think it did drag a little bit. And by the time that I got to the end of the series, I was like, yeah, I'm ready for this to be over now. The next thing is that I just wish we'd had more magic. Like, I think elemental magic is quite overdone now, and I don't think anybody has a particularly fresh take on it. I would really like somebody to do a bit of a fresh take on elemental magic. If anybody knows of any books that do that, let me know. Because I actually love elemental magic as a concept, but I think it's such an overdone magic system now, and nobody's really doing anything new with it. So I think that was my issue, but at the same time, I appreciate that this series was written like quite a long time ago in the grand scheme of things. So I can be more forgiving of it. Overall, I think this is a really solid series. I think if I had to collectively rank the entire series, I would say it's like a 4 stars, which is very solid. I think some books were like 3.75 and then some books were 4 stars. It's just a fun time. I think it's one of those series that you can really get engrossed into. You can read it very quickly. If you typically read adult fantasy and you just need a break from a lot of what we get in adult fantasy, I think this could be it. There is a very strong romantic subplot, but I didn't hate it. You know, it wasn't my favorite part. I don't actually like romance in my fantasy books anymore, unless I'm going to read a romance book or a romance fantasy book. But I didn't hate it. Yeah, I didn't mind it. I thought some of the romantic aspects were quite good, especially as it related to one character, but I'm not going to say who because of spoilers. But I think overall, very solid, very fun, very readable, good to read, you know, if you want something fast-paced and action-packed with good characters and pretty solid writing. Let me know down below if there's any other YA series that you think I should read. The only other one that I'm going to read is Fireborn. That's the next one, and that's probably going to be the last YA series I read, just because I'm not into YA. Like, there were definitely issues that I had with this series, but I didn't really talk about them just because I know it's YA and that's to be expected with YA. So yeah, don't recommend me any actually, because I'm probably not going to read them. But anyway, thanks for watching, folks. Please give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.